It's been a number of months now since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister and since you left the government. And there have been a huge number of policy reversals from the brief time that Liz Truss was Prime Minister and you were Business Secretary. Something that seems to be a little bit equivocal, however, is the government's support for one of your signature pieces of legislation, the retained EU law bill. Where is the government on this, in your view?
Well, as I understand it, the government is pushing ahead with the retained EU law bill, and I think this is tremendously important. You had an excellent interview recently with a very distinguished lawyer who said that he could do it by himself in a year and that a law firm could do it in a month. And I think that's right. I think the problems around it have been exaggerated, that all of these laws will have papers around them, would have required information when they were brought in. All of that is on file. Some of them will be kept as domestic law and just need rewording to make them UK law, for want of a better term. Others will be able to get rid of, to scrap, to have the Brexit bonus. And I don't think this is a particularly complicated process. There is obstructionism. The Remainers hate it because it is the key divergence from Europe, that it would make it very much harder for a government with a different policy to shadow Europe quietly once we've got rid of retained EU law. And that's why there's so much objection and obstruction from the Blob and from the House of Lords, who have an overwhelming majority, which has an overwhelming majority of Remainer peers.
To be clear, these are around 4,000 pieces of EU legislation on UK statute books that your bill, or well, I suppose now the government's bill, would want removed in 12 months. Is that possible?
Oh, it's very straightforward. Bear in mind, 1,400 of them had to be dug out of the National Archive because they were essentially not being used. So that's just clearing things out. It's mucking out the stables. It's the Augean stable of EU mess that is being washed out by old Father Thames. Then you've got 2,400 of them or so that are in use, that cover a wide range of things, some of which you might want to continue with, some of which you may want to change. I found as Energy Secretary that the emissions trading scheme, for example, which is in these regulations, so that's been amended to some extent, had a terrible effect on our steel industry. And therefore to look at whether you're doing things that make sense and to change them is really important. And it's crucial to remember that all these laws came in without any parliamentary scrutiny. They came in under the European Communities Act 1972 by fiat of the EU. They may have gone through the European Scrutiny Committee, but they couldn't be blocked by Parliament. And therefore they are being removed by a parliamentary process, by an Act of Parliament, and then ones that are kept will have a statutory instrument around them. So there's a proper democratic process.
When the Chancellor appeared on a Sunday political show not so long ago, he was asked about the UK's economic performance comparative to that of the EU. He was shown a number of facts and figures suggesting that friction between the UK and EU has created a problem when it comes to exports in particular. He responded by saying you're only looking at one side of the ledger, that there will be some friction between the UK and EU when it comes to particularly exports, but the other side of the ledger may well be regulatory divergence. Do you think for the Chancellor to follow through on that, this whole heap of EU law really does need more urgently looking at?
Oh, it's absolutely essential. It's why the tight deadline is important, because the benefits of Brexit are having a more competitive, more flexible economy, not following EU rules. So one of the things I would like to see is that parallel imports are allowed. So currently, if you want to buy a branded product in the United States that may be sold at a lower price in the US and bring it into the UK, that isn't allowed because of retained EU law. That just puts up prices for UK consumers. That is the type of friction that we want to get rid of through scrapping retained EU law. Now, the friction with the EU is that the EU, in spite of agreeing a trade deal with the UK, has, in some cases, decided not to implement it fully and to create difficulties. And that's partly because they're still cross with us, and that has an effect. But actually, the UK's economic performance compared to other European countries is remarkably good. And you should interview Julian Jessup, who's absolutely excellent on this and has all the details at his fingertips.
Now, looking more back to the rest of domestic policy, because of course the EU is one thing, but looking at, for example, planning, it may well be a hugely larger issue when it comes to our economy. And I was going through what was called the growth plan under Liz Truss, which had a number of pieces of supply-side reform within it, whether it was reform to childcare, to planning, to migration, all of these areas. And it seems to me that almost every single one has been ditched by this current government. Is that an issue? Is that going to hurt our growth prospects?
The planning issue is one that has been holding back the growth of this country for some time. We have a socialist planning system based on a late 1940s Planning Act, which thinks that central government can predict and plan the amount of building that we need. And we actually know from history that these centrally directed targets don't work, they don't provide the housing that people need. Government is not omniscient in that sense. It doesn't actually know what is going to be needed, whereas the market can provide. And I've thought for some time we need to move to a more market-based planning system. We need to free up the planning laws. And I think voters are ahead of politicians in this. I think they are ready for planning reform because they want their children and their grandchildren to be able to buy properties, which they can't at the moment.
And yet at least 2 times in the last decade, the government has attempted planning reform, first under Nick Bowles, under the coalition, and secondly under Robert Jenrick in the first Johnson ministry, or the second Johnson ministry.
First Johnson ministry, to be very pedantic.
After the election?
No, Liz Truss served 2 ministries because she was appointed by the Queen and then appointed by the King.
I see.
You're not reappointed after a general election if you...
Of course, because Tony Blair started this whole phony tradition of going to the palace to seem more legitimate.
Yes. Tony Blair did 1 term. He was appointed by the Queen and he then resigned. Liz Truss, very interestingly, in her very short period of office, did 2 terms.
I do remember now, because there were... It seemed to be after Tony Blair, sort of this driving to the palace after an election sort of fiction became part of the media sort of pomp and ceremony of it all. But
you're absolutely right. Nick Bowles did a really good job as planning minister. He was very good at making the case for what needed to be done, and he used central government's powers effectively to unlock some of the planning problems. Regrettably, that was stopped as we got closer to an election. There was a nervousness in Downing Street, and his plans weren't carried on with. It was the same.
Dems in government.
And there were Lib Dems in government. This was the same point at which Michael Gove was moved from education, and an element of the radical policy making stopped.
And yet, Robert Jenrick's plans were put forward when the government had a majority of 80 in the House of Commons. They were worked through for years, consulted with interest groups and the rest of it, and they were withdrawn, and Robert Jenrick was moved from his position in cabinet.
The problem there was the algorithm. And I'm not a great fan of algorithms in this context, mainly because you can't put in enough information to get a proper answer out. It's the same with the modelling for COVID and so on. Why was that all wrong? It was all wrong because you didn't have enough information to put in the first place. Why were the algorithms wrong that led to the financial crisis in 2008? Because they didn't have a proper depth of information going in. And so the algorithm got a lot of attack and undermined the very sensible reforms that were being proposed beyond that.
And yet whenever new proposals are put forward, even in the LURB, as it's known, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, there has been a rebellion from your colleagues over what they see to be a more sort of liberalising instinct for planning. Is it not that your colleagues in particular, as well as the Lib Dems and some in the Labour Party as well, are fundamentally against a more liberal system of planning?
I actually think the electorate is ahead of the politicians, that's what I was saying. And that there are politicians who, they get 300 emails from 38 Degrees and they think this represents the views of the nation. It doesn't. It represents the views of a small number. There's the comment, is it Edmund Burke's comment about the crickets in the field making a frightful noise whilst the stately oxen standing in the field are being ignored. And I think there's a lot of politics that listens to the crickets and ignores the stately oxen.
Did you support Simon Clarke's amendment to the Levelling Up Bill that was to allow new onshore wind farms, which were briefly legalised by Liz Truss, or she said she wanted to legalise them in parallel with onshore shale gas as well, these two sort of parallel energy liberalisations with community consent? The former Levelling Up Secretary Simon Clarke put an amendment towards the Levelling Up Bill to re-allow that. The government's now accepted that. Did you support that?
Actually, in this, I think this is the routine decision for governments to make, and I'm supporting government policy. That I don't think backbenchers want to rebel on every passing whimsy, and I didn't think that was an issue of fundamental constitutional importance. If the government wanted to do it, that's fine by me. If the government doesn't want to do it, that's equally fine by me. I was willing to support the government view. If you ask me what I thought the right policy was, though not one I would rebel on, I was in favour both of shale gas and indeed of onshore wind if local communities wanted it. I really like the idea that people will get lower energy prices or cash payments if these things take place near them. I think compensating people for loss of amenity or simply because the gas is under their ground, because the government pinched gas under people's ground in the 1920s, 1930s. They said the law wasn't clear, so we better say it belongs to the Crown. I mean, it's absolute fiddle, but never mind. Allowing people to make money is a good thing.
It's interesting because two people who did put their names to that amendment were Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. Have you had many conversations with Liz Truss and Boris Johnson since they've left office?
I'm in touch with both of them. I haven't gone in particularly to the details of the government's legislative programme, but obviously I'm in touch with both of them.
Because it does seem to many, at least in the press, that there is a schism within the Conservative Party, that there are those who perhaps are more sceptical of a Treasury view of things, those who perhaps are more keen on going for growth, what might be crudely described as those who are more boosterish about Britain, versus those who want to sort of count the cash. Does that schism exist?
Well, the Conservative Party is a party of individuals. We're not a collectivist party. And therefore you would expect us to have lots of individual ideas, but we have one unified purpose, which is maintaining a Conservative government. So, yes, of course people have their views. It'd be silly of me to pretend to you that everyone thinks exactly the same thing. I'm not sure my views of the dead hand of the Treasury are suitable for polite daytime television. But that doesn't mean that I'm not supporting the Prime Minister. I want him to succeed. I want the Chancellor to succeed. And it is in the interest of the Conservative Party to be reasonably disciplined.
It's interesting because the Prime Minister was asked just a few days ago about why anyone under the age of 45 would possibly consider voting Conservative. And it does seem to me that this is a constituency that has rather been lost in very recent years from the Conservative Party. What do you think is behind that?
Oh, a number of things. First of all, housing. That people are not able to buy houses in their 20s, they're waiting to their 30s and sometimes into their 40s. So that is why we need to build more houses. We need people to have a stake in society. But the other thing is, we've allowed the left to go into the universities and make the speeches, and we haven't been going in. But if we go in and say, look, who do you want to run your life? Do you want to run it yourself, or do you want it run by the state? Do you want the state to allow you to keep some of your money, or do you want low taxes because it's your money in the first place? Do you want to be able to buy your own home because we're going to reform planning so that you can? If we do all those things, then I think we appeal to all generations.
It's a very compelling message that you make, but looking at each of those points in turn, if you want to buy your own home, well, the government's failed on planning reform. If you want low taxes, well, the government's levelling the highest taxes in the recorded history of this country. Young people were locked in their homes for 2 years to protect the old. On each of those points, the government hasn't made that much of a compelling case.
Well, I think on the last point, Boris Johnson provided us with more freedom than any other potential leader would have done. And I think we were very lucky to have him because Other countries, continental countries, locked down and enforced much more rigorously than we did, and the pressure on the Prime Minister the then Prime Minister, was to lock down more fiercely. And I don't know if you saw this very sinister thing that some official admitted, that they used nudge theory to try and persuade the Prime Minister to wear a mask. So they showed him all these pictures of other world leaders wearing masks and then one of him not wearing a mask to try and nudge the Prime Minister into wearing a mask. Now, I think there's had surprisingly little reporting, but I think it's absolutely outrageous that officials thought it was their job to play sort of mind games with the Prime Minister who had a democratic mandate. But basically, we would have been worse off and more locked down if we hadn't had a freedom-loving Prime Minister like Boris Johnson. Just think if it had been Jeremy Corbyn or Sir Keir, who quite likes telling people what to do. On taxation, taxation is too high. Taxation needs to come down. That must be a priority for Conservatives. We need to look at expenditure. We need to get expenditure under control and allow people to keep their own money. And yes, I agree with you. Planning reform is something we needed to have been more forthright about.
Looking then at sort of your time in government, do you think that there were many mistakes made under Liz Truss as Prime Minister? Clearly, you agree with the intentions, but that crucial point at which the markets lost confidence in the United Kingdom, for a Conservative government to be at the helm at that point, what was the major mistake?
Well, of course, mistakes are always made. It's part of the human condition to make mistakes. Perfection is not within the human gift. There was a concatenation of circumstances that meant that the financial statement in late September 2022 had consequences that led to the end of that government pretty quickly. It coincided with the Bank of England failing to raise interest rates enough and being slow in dealing with the inflationary problem. I mean, an independent Bank of England has one task, to keep inflation at 2%. It has manifestly failed at that task. That is not the government, that is the independent Bank of England. As a minister, we all had to pretend the Bank of England was doing marvellously. Well, it wasn't. It's an institution that has let the country down. But because the government was covering up for the Bank of England, it took all the blame for difficulties in the financial markets, which was partly the government's fault, but not entirely.
Of course, there were those that said that interest rates should have been raised. Patrick Minford was one during that leadership campaign over the summer. But of course, now the big political issue is that mortgage rates are up. Isn't that a consequence of raising rates?
Yes, of course it is. But if you've got inflation, you've got to raise interest rates. I mean, inflation is such a problem, you can't just pretend it's not there and not raise rates. What the Bank of England shouldn't have done was the final stage of quantitative easing during the pandemic, which added fuel to the fire and added a certain amount to the inflation rate. And going back further, it should have been normalising interest rates in the 20 teens.